I hope everyone is there, and I welcome you all on behalf of PNDS. Uh, we have thought to organize this session on the critical appraisal of nutrition research, as we thought that it will be worthy to request Dr. Vimal to teach our members the critical appraisal process, how to examine research evidence to judge its trustworthiness, value, and relevance in the particular context. And I think it is very important for dietitians and nutritionists and even the nutrition students as well to know how to critically appraise any article or research. So I would like to introduce Dr. Vimal Karani. Um, Dr. Vimal has been conducted a session for us, I think 2-3 years before. And last year also we planned a session, in-personal session with Dr. Vimal Karani. We planned it for Karachi. But due to COVID situation, we could not conduct that workshop on nutrigenomics. So hopefully this year we will be able to conduct this workshop online due to the current situation. So now I would request Dr. Vimal to please introduce yourself, and you can also take the lead now onwards.
Thank you, Fayza. Thank you so much for the introduction. Should we start now? We just have 29 participants.
I think we should start our session. Yes, I think we should start because we have communicated everyone to be on time, and if we delay the session, then the ending of our session will be delayed also. So
exactly, yeah. Okay, fine. So let me share the screen if you want. Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we can share. We can see the screen, Vimal.
Okay, a very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you all so much for joining the critical appraisal session. So critical appraisal of a research article is very crucial for any researcher, whether the person is from the field of nutrition or dietetics or even biochemistry or molecular biology, any field of research. Critical appraisal thinking is very, very crucial when it comes down to reading a research article. So how much of the evidence should we take into consideration when we are trying to develop an hypothesis for our own research work? So critical appraisal is very crucial. So in today's workshop, the agenda is going to be like this. So from 2:30 to 3:15 p.m., it's going to be an introduction session. And then from 3:30 to 4:15, that's going to be group activity. So you're already into 5 different groups. So you will have to go into different Zoom sessions and you will have to carry out the discussions. I'm going to give you some overview about like what exactly you will be doing as part of the group activity. And the last part of the session will be the critical appraisal discussion. So that will be again back to the main Zoom session. So starting with what is a critical appraisal? So critical appraisal is basically a systematic process which is being used to identify the strengths and the weaknesses. Every research article will have its own strength and the weaknesses. There's no research article which doesn't have any weaknesses or which doesn't have any strength. There is some novelty which is linked to any article, and there are limitations as per any article. And the main reason why you're trying to identify the strengths and the weaknesses is basically to understand the usefulness and the validity of the research finding. How do you know whether a research article is useful for you? When you read an article, how do you assess it? How do you judge whether the article is reliable, whether the findings are valid? So critical appraisal is an important element of evidence-based medicine. It need not be a research article. Even if you read some news on the newspaper, how do you know that that information that you're reading is 100% true positive finding? So this is exactly where you need to apply your critical appraisal thinking. And that is purely based on the evidences that has been identified in relation to that finding. So the whole idea about the critical appraisal is to identify the strengths and the weaknesses, because this is one of the main limitations in students and also in academics. That includes me as well. Because when we read an article, we are looking for some information and we just get that information and we use it for writing or introduction, or for writing or developing a hypothesis, or for writing a review article. We don't judge whether the information that you're taking from a research article, is it true positive finding? Are the findings reliable? So how do you judge them? So that's exactly what I'm going to cover in the introduction section. So what are the main components of a research critical appraisal? So there are two important components. One is looking at the appropriateness of the study design. So generally, when you write a research article, you develop a hypothesis, and based on the hypothesis, you frame your objectives or your research aims. And once you have the objectives ready, then what are the methods that you're going to use to achieve those objectives? And as part of the methodology, you have to design your study. What kind of a study design you're going to use? For example, you're going to do a population-based study or an intervention study, a dietary intervention study. So what kind of a study design you're going to use? So the study design has to be very appropriate for the research question. So they both should be interconnected to each other. And also, the second important thing is, what are the methodological features of the study design? Okay, you're going to do a cross-sectional study. You're going to do a population-based study. So what methods you're going to use? How are you going to assess the dietary intake? How are you going to assess the physical activity levels? So there are various aspects that you need to take into consideration when you're reading the study design or when you're reading the methodological features. And the other factors to consider, the statistical methodologies. Because statistics is a very important component of any research that you do. Any kind of a research you do, at the end, what matters is the p-value that you write over there to show whether your finding is significant or not significant. Remember one thing, just because the p-value is not significant, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a biological significance. At the same time, even if the p-value is not significant, or if it is highly significant, it doesn't mean that the finding has got a strong biological significance. So that you will have to understand very clearly, because don't go blindly by the p-value. The p-value can be less than 0.00002 or something. It could be highly significant, but there might not be any biological plausibility. It could be just an accidental significant finding. But sometimes the p-value might not be significant, but still there might be a biological significance. So that you will have to identify by reading the paper and applying the critical appraisal skills. And most importantly, one of the most important questions that you will have to question yourself when you're reading a research article is, what is the relevance of the research to one's own practice? How do you know, like, the information that is present in your article, whether that has got relevance to, for example, the field of nutrition or whether the field of dietetics? So you need to assess and judge the relevance of the research. So for that, you need to have a very strong background in your area of research, whether it's nutrition or dietetics or biochemistry or any field of research. So these are some of the important things that you will have to take into consideration. The first important thing is the study design. And secondly, if this is going to be the study design, are you going to use these methodologies? Okay, fine, you're going to use these methodologies for dietary intake, for example, FFQ for dietary intake, and you're going to use GPAC for physical activity measurement, and you're going to use these statistical methodologies. So you need to have a clear thinking of what exactly you're going to do when you're doing a study. Because eventually when you write up the paper, you have to be very clear. If you're not clear, people who are reading the paper will not understand anything either. So that is very crucial. So what are the things to remember? The first important things, when you read an article, you have to find whether the findings are reliable. So how do you know whether the findings are reliable? Because you have to apply your critical appraisal thinking over there, whether the study question is appropriate, whether the study design is appropriate, and most importantly, whether that is there an hypothesis for the study. Because the hypothesis is the one that determines your entire study. If your hypothesis is not clear, then the entire study goes wrong. So you have to judge whether the findings are reliable. And secondly, do they make any sense? Is there any sense of the results that the study has shown? So making sense of the result is very, very important, and know what these results mean in the context of the decision they are making. Sometimes when you read in some research articles, you will see that the results, there are so many results. For example, there might be a study like where they had looked at the saturated fat and how the saturated fat is associated, increased consumption of the saturated fatty acids is being associated with higher BMI, higher fasting blood sugar levels, and higher levels of lipids, and increased risk of diabetes, increased risk of obesity. There are so many results in the results section of the paper. But eventually, the conclusion will be consuming higher amounts of saturated fatty acids is associated with increased risk of cardiometabolic diseases. So that is a clear conclusion based on so many results. That is a good paper. Sometimes you will see that a paper where they are reporting several findings, several results, eventually the conclusion will be quite messy. There is no clear conclusion. So you need to identify whether these results, do they mean anything in the context of the decision that they are making? Because decision making is very crucial when it comes down to critical appraisal. Because forget about the research article, it is you who's reading and judging the paper. So you need to be very clear about it. For example, if you're a journal editor and you have to make a decision whether you're going to accept the paper or you're going to reject the paper. So if you're going to accept the paper, it means that the paper has to be really good. The findings have to be reliable, and they should make some good sense, and whether the results are in line with the decision that is being made. Or if you're rejecting the paper, then it means that there is something wrong with the paper. But you have to give a valid reason why you are rejecting the paper. What are the reasons? And there are different types of questions that you can answer as part of your study. And according to the question, you have to have your own unique study design, because all the studies cannot have the same study design. The study design will vary according to your question. For example, if it's something relating to etiology, what are the causes of a particular disease? What caused this illness? For example, last year when COVID started, there were so many issues and so many risk factors that were identified. Being exposed to the virus is one of the most important things, but there were other aspects as well. So when you're determining the etiological factors, then you need to have a question like which is going to be something more relating to a study design, which is like longitudinal study design. Okay, I'm being exposed to this virus. So how long does it take to develop the illness? My immunity levels are very low. So what kind of a diet I should consume? And if I'm consuming this diet, how long does it take for me to boost my immunity levels? So it takes some time. So which means that you need to have a longitudinal study design. And next one is a diagnosis. What does this test result mean in this patient? Let's take the same example of COVID-19. So when this COVID-19 started, there were so many tests where they came up with, okay, this test can identify whether a patient is COVID-19 and whether this patient has got this viral infection. So there were so many diagnostic tests that were available in the beginning, and eventually we all ended up with the best test being the RT-PCR. So you are trying to develop a research question to identify which diagnostic test is giving 100% specificity and sensitivity. That is very, very crucial. And prognosis. What is likely to happen to this particular patient? See, for example, I'm giving him a drug, and whether the drug has got a positive impact on the patient. So which will take some time. So which means that you have to do a kind of a prospective study. And the next question, harm. Is having been exposed to a particular substance or a chemical likely to do any harm? So let's take the example of farmers, agricultural farmers. The farmers are constantly being exposed to insecticides and pesticides and various fertilizers. So how long does it take for these farmers to develop diseases, chronic diseases such as cancer? So again, like you can do a prospective study, a longitudinal study, a cohort-based study design. So for each question, you have a particular kind of a study design. And looking at the effectiveness, is this treatment likely to help patients with this illness? So you're trying out different trial and error methods like giving vitamin D supplementation or vitamin C supplementation, taking the example of COVID-19 patients. So this is exactly what was happening last year. People were giving different doses of vitamin D supplementation to see whether that has got any impact in reducing the symptoms in COVID patients. So you're looking at the efficacy of a particular drug or a supplementation or dietary supplementation. And qualitative, what are the outcomes that are most important to patients with this particular condition? So for example, there's a new disease in the population. So what are the symptoms? And how is the disease caused? And what are the outcomes of the disease? If I have that disease, for example, if you have obesity, then you're likely to become diabetic, and the diabetes is a risk factor for the development of cardiovascular disease. So you are following up the individuals over a period of time to know whether a particular disease can lead to other outcomes. So that's a qualitative analysis of looking into a longitudinal study design. So there are different types of questions which will require different study design. So when you're reading a research article, see what the question is. For this question, whether the study design is appropriate. Some of the things to remember when you're reading any article, whether it's a randomized controlled trial or a literature review or a systematic review or an original research article, three important things that you will have to remember is whether the findings are valid, whether the results, do they make a proper good sense, and thirdly, relevance to your field of research. Because sometimes you might see like some strange articles in nutrition related journals. So they might not be directly related to nutrition, but they're probably giving a public health message for nutritionists. So if it is not relevant for the nutritionist, they should have been published in a journal which is not related to nutrition. So that is entirely the decision of the editor, the editorial board member. So if you're going to be an editorial board member, you have to see whether that relevance has got something to do with nutrition. So validity, results, do they make proper sense, and the relevance to one's own research is very, very important. And it is always necessary to consider the following questions. So what are these questions? The first main thing is, as a research being conducted in such a way as to minimize the bias. So what is a bias? So let me give you an example. For example, you're doing a study in 100 people, and in those 100 people you have collected, you see that there are 80 men and 20 women. Okay, so there's an imbalance in the number of men and women. So if you're seeing a very interesting finding that increased consumption of saturated fatty acid is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So how will you make the conclusion? So if this is going to be your conclusion, how do you know that it is happening in those 100 people? And how do you know that it is not happening only in men and not in women? Because there are only 20 women, 80 men are there in your 100 in your study cohort. So how do you make this decision? So if you publish this paper, then immediately I will come up and say that there is a gender bias and you haven't minimized the bias. So the best way to approach that would be stratifying the data, that is doing the analysis separately in men and separately in women. If they have done that in that paper, it means that they have minimized the bias. Right? So if the research has been done in such a way that they have minimized the bias, the next question is, what does the study show? So what is the main finding? So the main finding is, even after stratification by men and women, we still see an association between saturated fatty acids and cardiovascular disease. So we are able to see that both in men and women. So that would be an important result and a finding. And what do the results mean for the particular patient or context in which a decision is being made? So for example, a heart disease patient is reading your research article, so what does that mean for that particular patient? So he will get an impression that he has to reduce the consumption of saturated fatty acids based on that finding, right? So eventually the person who's going to read your paper is basically the patient or other nutritionists or dietitians or students or academics who are going to use your finding to develop another hypothesis, or they're going to use your finding to write a systematic review or a literature review. So the message that you're conveying, especially in the field of nutrition and dietetics, the message that you're going to convey out of your research work, that has to be very clear, and it has to have a public health message. And if you're conveying a public health message, public is reading your research finding. So you have to be very clear that you have minimized all the bias. It's not only the gender bias, it could also be age-related bias. For example, if I'm taking 100 people, in 100 people, 80 people belong to the age group above 60 years, and 20 people belong to the age group below 20 years. So I'm bringing an imbalance in the number of people who belong to the age group above 60 and those who belong to the age group below 20. So there's an imbalance. So if there is an imbalance, then you stratify those 100 people into 80 people above 60 years and 20 people below 20 years. So this is the way you have to stratify and see whether the effects are still significant in these two groups. So these are the several statistical methodologies that an article should have used to minimize the bias. So when you read a paper, you have to think from different angles. The critical appraisal thinking requires something very basic, nothing else. It's just the common sense. So how do you assess the evidence? You're reading news from the newspapers, and you're getting information from various TV channels, and different organizations are proposing different dietary recommendations and different, and of course, the Cochrane collaboration, which is more relevant for the trials, and also the nutrition societies, dietetic societies, they're coming up with various recommendations. So which information is more reliable? So how do you judge whether a particular information is relevant for you? So you have to look at the source of the information. What is the motive for providing that information? And who is providing that information? The expertise and the experience of the person who is giving that information. That is very important. And when you look at the information, is that based on a scientific research, or is it some expert giving his opinion? If it's just an expert opinion, then which means that it is not evidence-based. It's just they are giving their opinion about a particular information. So you can't just rely on it. But if it is based on a scientific research finding, then you can rely on those research work. An opinion. So if it is just an opinion from an expert, then you cannot rely on that information. And experience of the person also is very much important. Of course, even if it is an opinion, and if that information is coming from, for example, a Nobel Prize winner, then that could be reliable. And whether that information is that being provided as a data, or is it a research article, and how that data has been interpreted. These are the key things that you will have to look at when you're reading a research article, not just a research article from a journal, even if it's an information that has been published in the news. So this is basically a press release of my work that I published last week. So the message that has been put on the press release is that genetic risk of heart disease may be due to low omega-3 linked biomarker. So this biomarker is adiponectin. So this is the press release, and this is the title of the press release. Now I'll go to my original research paper. So this is my research paper. So it clearly states that circulating adiponectin, the adiponectin is that biomarker. It mediates the association between omentin gene polymorphism and cardiometabolic health in Asian Indians. So here I'm saying that the adiponectin is mediating the link between the genetic risk and cardiometabolic health. But if you look at the press release, it clearly said that the genetic risk of heart disease may be due to low levels of omega-3 linked biomarker. That omega-3 linked biomarker is nothing but the adiponectin. In my paper, I have mentioned this particular sentence saying that modulation, that is improving your adiponectin levels, might be an effective way to overcome the genetic risk. And I've also mentioned few lines about how to improve your adiponectin levels. So one way could be consuming omega-3 fatty acids, and the other way is doing exercise, and the other way could be the drug therapies. So this is exactly the main message. But if you look at the press release, they have clearly highlighted that the genetic risk of heart disease could be due to low levels of this omega-3 linked biomarker. But after I posted this particular press release in social media, I started to get a lot of emails from several people because they totally forgot to see that word may be. They thought it is a causal effect. They thought if the adiponectin levels goes down in your body, the genetic risk will be higher. So they started to panic and they started to ask me, like, how do I check my genetic risk? And what kind of omega-3 supplementation should I consume? And what are the ways to improve adiponectin levels? Well, I've just suggested that adiponectin levels, improving the adiponectin levels could be one of the ways, because adiponectin is not the main causative factor for heart disease. There are several factors which are contributing to the development of heart disease. This is just an example to show you that how public is taking information from the news. I'm 100% sure that people who read the press release wouldn't have read the main article. But as nutritionists and dietitians, it's very crucial. Don't go just by the news that has been posted on in social media or in the newspapers. Please go to the original research article, go through the research article and try to find a reliability and the validity of the finding. Because when you talk to your clients or to your customers or to the patient, you need to be very confident in giving the right information to them, for which you need to have a very strong basic background in your area of research. And how do you improve that? By critical thinking. So when talking, I'm just going to give you some of the ways by which you can look into a research article. Because if you're doing a nutrition study, or even if you're reading a nutrition related research article, what are the things that you need to take into consideration? So coming from the point of nutritional epidemiology, there are 4 important principles. The first important principle is the outcome. When you're reading an article, there is always a focus on the disease. The disease is the outcome, and the exposure is the dietary factor. For example, the saturated fatty acid, consuming high levels of saturated fatty acid is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Let's take that example. So saturated fatty acid is the exposure, and the outcome, the disease, is the cardiovascular disease. So that's once you have this particular question, whether the saturated fatty acid consumption is it associated with cardiovascular disease, to answer that question, you need to have a study design. It could be any kind of a study design. It could be an observational study design. So if it's observational, whether is it cohort or case control. Cohort means taking 100 people and giving them saturated fatty acids. They're consuming a particular diet, and you're seeing like how many of them are developing cardiovascular disease. Or you can take case control study design. The people who are consuming high amounts of saturated fatty acid and people who are on a healthy diet who are not consuming saturated fatty acid. It's a case control study design. Or an experimental study design. You're taking 10 people, 5 people are given high fat diet, and another 5 people are being given low fat diet, and you're seeing like how many people are showing any positive impact or a negative impact in terms of their health outcomes. So which will be an experimental trial or a dietary intervention trial. So these are the 3 important factors, and the most important one is the confounding factors. Because when you do any kind of a research study, there will always be a third variable. That is, you have the exposure, which is the first variable, and outcome is the second variable, and the confounders are the third variable. So you should not allow the third variable to interfere between the exposure and the outcome. You should inhibit the effect of confounding on the exposure outcome association. Because age and gender, they are the most common confounding factors. Why? So let's go back to the same example that I was explaining. So if you have 100 people, and I said that 80 people are men and the remaining 20 people are women. So when you're doing this study and I'm showing the association between the saturated fatty acids and cardiovascular disease, and as I said before, it could be because of the gender imbalance, because you know that men have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, so the findings could be more applicable for men and not for women. So their gender is a confounding factor because you have an imbalance in the number of men and women. So the best way to overcome that would be, when you do a statistical analysis, you suppress the effect of gender. But how do you suppress the effect of gender? That is, as part of the statistical methodology, you can adjust for the gender variable. So these are some of the statistics related methodologies that you do to inhibit the effect of confounding. Likewise, age. So if you're taking 100 people, you can't expect all 100 people to be of the same age. So one person will be 20 years, another person will be 30, 40, 50, 60, it will be in different age groups. So there could be an effect of age as well. So how do you suppress the effect of the age? You adjust for the age. So when you read a research article, you need to make sure that whether the study has adjusted for age, gender, and various other confounding factors. So I'm trying to show that the saturated fatty acid is not good for a person because that can lead to the development of cardiovascular disease. So it's not just the age and gender, it could also be obesity. If a person is obese and consuming saturated fatty acid and he's developing cardiovascular disease, so how do you know it is only the saturated fatty acid that is contributing to cardiovascular disease and it is not obesity? So you'll have to suppress the effect of obesity as well. So this is how you have to critically think and understand what are the factors that needs to be adjusted. And when you're reading an article, you need to think all these aspects. So these are the four important principles: outcome, exposure, design, and the confounding factors. So looking at the different study designs, so one is the cross-sectional study design, that is doing the study at this point of time. For example, today I'm doing this study. I'm collecting 100 people. Or in this week, I'm collecting 100 people for my study. I'm doing an analysis and I'm trying to see the saturated fatty acid, is it being associated with cardiovascular disease? So that's a cross-sectional study. But when you go backwards, what is happening in terms of the saturated fatty acid consumption and cardiovascular disease over the period of 6 months or over the period of 10 years or over the period of last 1 year? So in the last 1 year, so how many people have developed cardiovascular disease by consuming saturated fatty acids? So you're doing a retrospective cohort analysis, which is a longitudinal study design. That is, you're looking backwards, a retrospective analysis over a period of time. How many people have developed cardiovascular disease, right? So that's a retrospective study design. Again, as I said before, if you have a question that is pertaining to this moment of time, then you have to do a cross-sectional study. But if your question is like, how many people have developed cardiovascular disease by consuming saturated fatty acids over the period of last 6 months, then it's retrospective. And if I'm doing case control, for example, 50 cases and 50 controls, right? And I want to know like how many people of controls have actually consumed saturated fatty acid and have not developed cardiovascular disease until today. So I'll have to go back and see what diet they have consumed. What was the level of saturated fatty acids they have been consuming in the last 6 months. So which is again a case control study design, but a retrospective case control study design. But on the other hand, if you're going forwards, that is, you're trying to follow up the individuals. I'm taking 100 people, right? And I'm following up these 100 people for the next 10 years. Out of these 100 people, how many people are going to develop cardiovascular disease by consuming saturated fatty acid? So that will be a prospective longitudinal study design. And of course, a randomized control trial, which is quite familiar to you all, or the dietary intervention trial. Like, for example, I can take 100 people and 50 people are put on a low carb diet, and another 50 people who are being put on a high carb diet, and you're doing basically an intervention, and you can follow up those people for 1 year or 2 years and see how many people are losing weight and how many people are gaining weight and how many people haven't seen any particular change in their weight. So these are the different questions you can answer. And as I said before, different questions will have different study designs. So looking at the concept of how a cohort study happens. So when you're doing a follow-up study or longitudinal study or a prospective study, so these circles are the people who are exposed to saturated fatty acids, and the squares are basically people who are unexposed, who are not exposed to saturated fatty acids. And over a period of time, you can see that some people who have been exposed to saturated fatty acids, they have developed the disease. The red colors are the people who have developed the disease. But you can see that not all the exposed people have developed the disease. Only some of the exposed people have developed the disease. What could be the reason for this? One of the reasons is clearly that saturated fatty acid is not the only exposure. For a person to develop cardiovascular disease, it could be genetic risk, it could be saturated fatty acid, or it could be any other dietary factor, or lack of physical activity, or stress, and various other environmental factors. So this is exactly the message that you need to convey to the public. So they shouldn't get the impression that it is saturated fatty acid. So if I consume high amounts of saturated fatty acid, I'm definitely going to develop cardiovascular disease. No, that is not true. Some people who are consuming high amounts of saturated fatty acids, but along with high genetic risk or lack of physical activity, or in addition to various other stress and various or obesity, it could be various other factors. Only those people are actually developing the disease. And you can also see that people who are unexposed to saturated fatty acids, a person has also developed the disease, cardiovascular disease. Why? Because that person might not be consuming saturated fatty acid, or that person might not be consuming saturated fatty acid, but he or she might have been obese or not doing physical activity at all, or has got like high levels of stress, or it could be high levels of blood pressure. Right? So there could be various other factors. So when you do the interpretation, you have to have a clear thinking. Don't get blocked by the thought that saturated fatty acids will definitely lead to cardiovascular disease. No, there are various factors, because cardiovascular disease is a complex disease which are being caused by multiple factors, not just the genetic and environmental factor. There are several lifestyle factors which play a crucial role in the development of the. And looking at the hierarchy of evidence, so it all starts with the expert opinion. So there are several experts in the field of nutrition, dietetics, they can give the opinion, but you can get the opinion, but those opinions or the statements proposed by the experts, they are not 100% reliable. And then the time series experiments, looking at the effect of a particular diet at different time points. Of course, they will give some information, but that is not the usual diet or a consistent pattern. And then the cohort or the case control study design. So they are going to give you information about a cross-sectional analysis, the association between, for example, saturated fatty acids and cardiovascular disease. But it's not going to give you 100% information that people who are having consuming saturated fatty acids, they are definitely going to develop cardiovascular disease. You're not going to get that information. Then randomization, that is a controlled trial without randomization. So you're doing a trial, a clinical trial or dietary intervention trial, giving saturated fatty acids and those people without saturated fatty acids and seeing the effect. And ultimately, the best reliable evidence comes from the randomized controlled trials. When you read an article relating to an RCT, definitely the findings are reliable, but still, as I said at the beginning of the session, that every research article will have its limitations and advantages as well. There are both pluses and minuses for any research article. So any article, just because it's a randomized controlled trial, it doesn't mean that you can blindly rely on the findings. No. Every research article will have a section on the strengths and the limitations. So you need to acknowledge that when you are conveying the public health message. That's very, very crucial. So looking at the evidence-based medicine and nutrition. So in the medical field, in the clinical field, the intervention is purely because it's comparison of people who are being given the drug and people who are not being given the drug. So when you give the drug, it is just one compound and you know what the target tissue is. So it's just a single system. So if I if I take the medicine for headache, my headache is gone. So the effect is quite large. And as I increase the dose of the medicine, automatically the effect is much more higher. So I see a linear association. So the medicine is very much of a straightforward trial. But whereas when you do a nutrition related dietary intervention trial, you're basically using different diets. People are consuming different kinds of diets. You cannot see a consistent diet. So today I might be going to a restaurant, and tomorrow I might be eating at home, and day after tomorrow I might be visiting someone's home. So I keep changing my diet regularly. And the diet is not going to affect only one part of your body. It's going to have an impact on different tissues, multiple targets. And the effect is going to be very modest. Just because I'm consuming a high saturated fat diet today, tomorrow I'm going to develop cardiovascular disease. No, it doesn't happen like that. It takes over a time. And the response is going to be sigmoidal, differing response. So tomorrow I might be at a high risk of developing cardiovascular disease, but the next day I might have reduced my risk by consuming a healthy diet for next 1 or 2 weeks. So the effects are going to vary because the dietary pattern is not going to be consistent. It keeps changing. So looking at the WHO recommendation, how do they recommend? How do they give that universal dietary recommendation? It's all based on various findings. So according to them, there are 4 levels of evidence. The first one is the insufficient evidence. Insufficient evidence is where there are only few studies and limited evidence from RCT, and there is no biological plausibility. And the second level of evidence is possible. It is possible, but we do not know. That is, evidence comes mainly from case control and cross-sectional studies, because as I said, the cross-sectional studies cannot establish a causal relationship. It's only the longitudinal studies and the randomized controlled trials which can establish the causal relationship. And insufficient evidence from RCT and observational studies. And the last one, there is a biological plausibility. So that is a possible evidence. And the third one is probable evidence, that is fairly consistent associations. And there are some shortcomings of the studies, but there's definitely biological plausibility. And the last one is a convincing evidence. There are consistent associations, strong evidence from RCT, and there is definitely biological plausibility. So this is exactly how they apply to research articles before they give out or send out the universal dietary recommendations. It starts with insufficient, possible, probable, and convincing. Just because I'm publishing a research paper saying that saturated fatty acids are unhealthy for people who have cardiovascular disease, it doesn't mean that the WHO is going to take that paper and give out a universal dietary recommendation. No, you need to have a consistent associations, not just my research article, but you need hundreds and hundreds of research articles showing the same finding across different populations, different ethnic. So the most important thing is in terms of developing an hypothesis. So when you do a research article, so what is an hypothesis? Hypothesis is basically being developed based on the evidence that is existing in other studies. So once you have the hypothesis, you're going to design the study and you're going to see the validity of the study. And what are the results? Okay, if the study is valid and there's a defined hypothesis, what are the results? And then once the results are there, are they applicable to the population? Do the results have any public health message? So these are the 4 important things that you will need to assess when you're reading a research article. So scientific research usually requires hypotheses which can be tested. You have to come up with an hypothesis which can be tested. You cannot blindly come up with some weird hypothesis and say that you want to test it, because sometimes it cannot be tested. And all the original research papers, they do have an hypothesis, and they do test the hypothesis and describe the results. And the hypothesis is purely based on the previously existing information. And sometimes when you read the research article, the hypothesis might not be explained clearly, but you will have to find what the hypothesis is from the introduction, because this is exactly what you're going to do as part of the group activity. So sometimes you might not see the hypothesis, but the hypothesis is hidden in the introduction section. So the hypothesis is used to develop the experiment and the study. And the reason why you're having that experiment is to test the hypothesis, whether your hypothesis is right or wrong. So clearly stated hypotheses are very much important to assess the quality of the study, because if the hypothesis is not clear, then obviously a person who's reading that paper will not be able to understand what exactly they have done. So the hypothesis should be testable, and there should be some explanation on why this particular hypothesis is being tested. And most importantly, is that hypothesis being relevant to your question? That is that relevant to nutrition or dietetics, whatever your expertise is? So multiple hypotheses can often result in fishing, which means that if the hypothesis is not clear, then it means that the person who's doing that research is not clear about what to find from the study. So he will be fishing out for significant p-values. So you might be coming up across some papers like where they have mentioned that this is my hypothesis, these are my objectives, but the conclusion will be completely different from what their research question is. And these are the articles which eventually go into low impact factor journals. So we're looking at the nutrition and health. So for example, nutrition, let's take the example of saturated fatty acid, and health, let's take the example of cardiovascular disease. So when you're testing for the association between nutrition and health, there are two ways by which you can do that. One is the in vitro system, where you can have a model system or the tissue culture, looking at the underlying mechanisms of kinetics, or you could do an in vivo analysis, looking at the animal studies and the human studies, looking at the safety of a particular drug or particular dietary factor, or doing a population-based study, looking at the population, taking 100 people and looking at the impact of saturated fatty acid consumption on cardiovascular disease outcomes. So these are the only few possible ways by which our study is being designed. So when you're looking at the association between the nutrition and health, try to understand whether is it an in vitro study or in vivo study. Is it model system or tissue culture or cell culture study or animal study or human study? Is it, if it's human study, is it a cross-sectional study or a dietary intervention study? Okay, if it's a dietary intervention, is it what is the follow-up period? How many people have they taken into consideration? What are the methodological features? So various aspects need to be understood. And coming to the study design, most importantly, the dietary intake information. So the dietary intake information is very crucial for providing the dietary advice and also for developing the national diet surveys, which gives information about the food production and the trends in the diet in a particular population, and what are the adverse effects of consuming a particular diet in the population. And also, of course, from the research wise, you're trying to give an information about what is the impact of the diet on health outcomes. So for which you need to assess the dietary intake. But how do you assess the dietary intake? So you can either look at the usual diet or the current diet. The usual diet is a consistent pattern, so which is more effective, whereas the current diet has got high day-to-day variability. So that can have an impact on your assessment. So that can lead to bias or confounding depending upon your research question. So there are basically three different dietary intake measurements. So one is basically the food frequency questionnaire, and DD is the diaries, and the 24-hour dietary recall. So each of these methods have got their own advantages and disadvantages. I'm sure you all are aware of these methods, but just briefly touching upon it. So the time frame for the food frequency questionnaire, like over a period of 3 months to 1 year, or the diet diaries, like over a period of a week, or 24-hour dietary recall in the last 24 hours, like what have you been eating. Generally, when you do a 24-hour dietary recall, you do a 3-day dietary recall. That is like 2 weekdays and one of the weekends. So that is how like you basically do a 24-hour dietary recall. And they are generally self-reported. So obviously, there's a self-reporting bias linked to each of these questionnaire-based methods. And that's why whether it's 100% accurate, definitely not. None of them are 100% accurate, especially when it comes to FFQ. There's a systematic error, larger systematic error that's being associated, because when you do like what the patient has been eating like for the last 6 months, even I do not remember like what I was eating 6 months ago. And in the last, especially in the last 1 year, because of this COVID, a lot of people would have changed their diet. And doing a study during this time is highly confounded and highly biased. So if you're going to read any article based on studies that have been published in the last 1 year, so you need to question all these things, taking into consideration of like what is happening around. And briefly touching upon, so before we break for the group activity, just briefly touching upon what is a systematic review, because a lot of students and academics, they have a thinking that literature review is almost similar to systematic review. Definitely not. Systematic reviews are so different. Of course, they both are literature-based reviews. When you do a literature review, you do an unsystematic selection of studies. That is what is called as a literature review. So that is, you have a very broad topic and you give an updated information about that topic. And you're trying to identify what are the missing gaps. Whereas when you do a systematic review, there's systematic selection of studies. You have a very specific question and you're trying to provide an answer based on your review. That is systematic review. Literature review is mostly about giving an update about a topic, whereas systematic review is trying to answer a question, a specific question. So this is just an example of a review. So for example, if you want to know what is the impact of the flavonols on heart, cardiovascular disease. So there are a lot of literature and news that has been going on. For example, flavonols and cardiovascular disease, and chocolate and cardiovascular disease. So when you look at the chocolate and cardiovascular disease, chocolate is basically has got different nutrients, and one of the nutrients is flavonols. So if my question is only about flavonols and cardiovascular disease, then accordingly I need to do a structure-based systematic review. So if I'm doing a literature review, so I'll come up with all these keywords, and these are the different number of articles that are available for each of these topics, and I do a literature review based on these numbers. So I do a random search and I do an update, I give an update, and I also give information about what is missing in the literature. Whereas when I do a systematic review, I go through a specific databases, and also I have a specific defined search terms, and also I need to specify the start date and end date of the research. For example, like from 2010 January until December 2020. So this is my time period. And I've taken articles only during this time period, and my confirmation or decision or conclusion is only based on these 10 years. So that is very specific when it comes to systematic review. So this is just an example of how a systematic review has been done, and which has been published in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in the year 2012. So you can see different databases that have been used, and they came up with 1,600 articles. From 1,600 articles, they have come down to 42 articles after using different inclusion and exclusion criteria. So when you do a systematic review, you have to have a predefined inclusion criteria or the exclusion criteria, how you're going to define. So which means that you need to have a very specific question. So these are the things that you will have to remember when you're reading a research article, right? So now coming to the group activities, so based on whatever we have done, coming to the group activities, so you have already been given a research article. So you will have to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of the research article. So you're already into 5 different groups. So in each group, there should be a leader or a moderator who will be assigned to chair the group discussion. And at the end of the group activity, come back to this Zoom session, and each group will share the strengths and the weaknesses of the article to other groups. That's exactly what we are going to do now. And this is the research article. It's a study that was published a few years ago, and it's actually a very interesting article. So let's see how this group discussion is going to go. To simplify the group discussion, so I'm going to give you 17 questions. So these are the 17 questions, and I want you to come up with the answers to these 17 questions. So I'll be sending a picture of the slide to the WhatsApp group, and I want all the groups to discuss and come up with the answers to all these questions. And that's what we are going to do now. Okay, so are there any questions before we move into the group discussion?
Dr. Vimal, a few participants or attendees have questioned in Q&A section and in chat. So you can just check the chat and the question answer tab. It's on the top of your screen, Q&A tab. So click.
Okay. So systematic review is a review article. Yes, it's definitely a review article. So the review articles could be either systematic reviews or literature reviews. So the literature review, when you write a literature review, for example, let me put it this way. So I'm writing a literature review on vitamins and obesity. So when I do a literature review, I'm going to collect information about vitamin A, vitamin B12, or vitamin D, vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin K. So I'm going to get information on different vitamins, and I'm going to have a section in my research article about like what are these vitamins doing in relation to obesity, and I'm going to give an updated information, and also I'm going to give information about what is missing in the literature and what needs to be focused. That is a literature review. Whereas when you do a systematic review, my topic will be very defined. For example, vitamin D and obesity. I want to know whether vitamin D supplementation is going to prevent obesity. That will be my question for systematic review, because it's a very defined question. I'm not going for all the vitamins. I have a very specific question, vitamin D and obesity. So accordingly, I'll be collecting articles only relating to vitamin D and obesity. Right? So that is how you do a systematic review. Whereas in a literature review, which is where you have a very broad topic and you can do any kind of a structure, you don't need to have a structure. You can frame it in whatever way which you think is comfortable and which you think is very easily readable for the public. And how can I differentiate between reliability of research and validity of the research? Well, again, coming back to this, you need to apply. It's purely based on your expertise, how strong you are in your field. I'm not sure whether you are a nutritionist or a dietitian. So one thing that I would like to mention over here is whether you're a nutritionist or dietitian or a biochemist or molecular biologist, we are now moving towards a future where you need to have multidisciplinary expertise. Just because you're a nutritionist, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be learning about molecular biology. You should have knowledge about molecular biology as well, because only then you can understand how a diet that goes inside your body is having an impact on different health outcomes. So you need to judge the reliability and the validity of the research purely based on your expertise. So maybe like when you do this critical appraisal of this article that I've given it to you, then probably you will be able to identify how reliable the findings are and how can you judge the validity of the research findings. How meta-analysis and systematic analysis are differentiated. Well, when you do a systematic review, basically you can take it to the next level of meta-analysis, or you can just end it up with the systematic review. So there are two ways by which you can look at the systematic review. So if you're taking it to the next level of meta-analysis, then you collect the information about the effect sizes. For example, going back to the same example, vitamin D supplementation and obesity. So there might be 10 studies which have shown that high dose of vitamin D supplementation can prevent obesity. There might be 5 studies which have shown that vitamin D supplementation doesn't have any impact on obesity. So you're collecting the effect in all these studies and you're meta-analyzing all these effects together and you're creating a forest plot. The plot is basically a graphical representation of doing the meta-analysis, and you're seeing whether the effects are taking into consideration of all the studies, whether the effects are significant. So that is how a systematic review is taken to the next level of meta-analysis. And there's one more question over here. Question regarding the timeline for writing the review article, because in the first time writing a review article, I've noticed it depends entirely. Like if you're, it depends on the topic as well. If you're choosing a topic, something relating to, for example, the same topic, vitamin D and obesity, there are plenty of articles. But if you're taking something completely a new topic, for example, genetics or genes and diet in relation to COVID-19, not many studies have been published. So there are, it depends entirely on your topic. You can either devote like 3 months or 6 months or even 1 year for a review article. So I've spent like even 2-3 years for writing a review article, and I've also spent just 2 months in writing and publishing a research article. It entirely depends on the topic. So in terms of the biological plausibility is, for example, I'm saying that high levels of high consumption of saturated fatty acids is associated with cardiovascular disease. But how high levels of saturated fats are actually causing cardiovascular disease? What is happening internally? That is the biological plausibility. You can show a significant p-value, but you will also have to prove that biologically consuming the saturated fats can increase the risk of heart disease or the cardiovascular disease. So you have to show what is happening inside and also outside. The inside happening is a biological mechanism. And systematic review is based on PRISMA guidelines, and the recommendation you talk about is based on Hill's criteria. Yes, you can use it. This is exactly what I was mentioning in terms of the Cochrane collaboration. So when you write all these articles and when you do a systematic review, you need to follow all the guidelines. And also when you write a systematic review or any article, you have to follow the journal guidelines. So you will have to submit a checklist of what criteria you have used, and all these aspects need to be taken into consideration when you're submitting your research article to a journal. And there are some messages in the chat box. Any other question? Which SPSS you use in your research data? Sorry, I didn't understand. What do you mean? There's only SPSS 1. So are you talking about the version SPSS? You have like now 26 or 27, something like that.
So how are we doing this? के सारे 17 questions एक person पहले बताएगा और फिर दोबारा, या हम कुछ questions एक group बता दे और कुछ questions दूसरे group बता दे?
I think so. Dr. Vimal will explain how everyone can explain. इसलिए आप सबको allow करती है, तो अभी वो बता देते हैं. ठीक है?
Fayza, group 3 से Rabia will present findings.
Can we start?
Everybody, Dr. Vimal will be.
Who will?
Dr. Vimal will be. I think when he will ask you to share your group findings, and then only you have to share yours, right? Please
yes,
wait.
Okay, guys. Yeah, okay, let me explain this. So I'm going to go through each and every question now. So I'm going to give the responses to each question, and we are going to compare the responses. One thing that you will have to remember is these 17 questions. So I have prepared some responses to these questions. So these responses are from my perspective. It is not necessary that you should have the same response. For example, is the study question relevant? So I might think that it is relevant from my perspective, but maybe from your perspective, you might think that it is not relevant for you. So don't expect the same answer to be present on the screen. It will vary, because my background is I'm a genetic and a nutritional epidemiologist. I'm a nutrigeneticist. Whereas you could be a dietitian, you could be a nutritionist, you could be a biochemist. So each person has got a different expertise, and from your experience and the expertise, the response could vary. For example, if you're submitting a paper to a journal, the journal editor will send the paper to different reviewers. Say, for example, 3 reviewers. One reviewer will say that I'm accepting the paper. It's a very good paper. It's very well written. I'm going to accept the paper. The other reviewer will say, no, I'm rejecting the paper. It is not relevant to the journal. It hasn't answered these questions. The study question is not relevant. So the other person will reject the paper. And the third person might be somewhere in between. Well, I have these comments. If you're able to respond to these comments, I'm happy to accept the paper. So the opinion, the perspective varies from one person to another person. So you cannot expect to have the same kind of answers. So what I'm going to do is, like, I'm going to show the responses for each of these questions, and each of the group leaders, if you have a different response, then you can share it with me so that everyone can hear how the perspectives can vary from one person to another person. Is that all clear, everyone?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
So starting with the first question, yeah. So is the study question relevant? So to me, I basically felt that the study question was very focused because they've clearly mentioned about what population they have studied. They're looking at the medical college students who are at different professional levels and from Pakistan, and the risk factors. The risk factors are basically the exposures, that is having a high caloric diet and those engaging in low levels of physical activity, which is the exposure, which is a risk factor, and the outcome is basically the obesity and pre-obesity, the exposure and the outcome. And the study is very relevant because there are no studies in relation to dietary patterns and physical activity levels which have been carried out in medical college students in Pakistan. And the prevalence of obesity in medical college students is unknown. So this is the first study of its kind. So to me, I felt the study question is very much relevant and it's very focused. Now, it's over to the group leaders. Do you have any other response?
Hi, this is Muzammila. Can you hear me?
Yes, okay. I can hear you.
I am group leader of group. On this exactly this first point was how could you mention high prevalence at the initial level, because the rest of the study is yet to be you will have to see the outcome. So how can you predict the high prevalence at the very initial level? This was our query for all of our group.
High prevalence, what do you mean by that? Because the answer for this question, it relies in the introduction, not in the results.
So how could you predict the word high in the title initially?
Oh, you're talking about the title of the paper.
Yeah.
The high prevalence of pre-obesity among medical college students. So this title has been decided based on the study findings. It has got nothing to do with the study question.
Okay.
Do you see my point?
Yes.
So this is what they have reported. So they wanted to get the attraction of the audience. They want to say that there is high prevalence of pre-obesity and obesity. It's not in comparison to any studies because there are no studies in medical college students.
Okay. Thank you.
But with regards to this question, is the study question relevant? Do you have any other perspective? Is anyone saying that the study question is not relevant?
No, we also wrote the answer as yes.
I think it's okay.
Group number 1.
Okay, so if everyone agrees, can I move on to the next question then?
Yeah, please.
I disagree.
Yes,
I
please.
disagree.
Okay.
This is Raihan Zahid from Group 3. I disagree because as per the results, the total percentage of obese people were 20.9% and of the total, and overweight were just 10.2%. So that makes a total of like 31% approximately. So how can we suggest that it's a high prevalence?
Okay, no, see, you're getting deviated from the question. The question is Is the study question relevant? Don't go into the results at all. The title of the paper.
Riya, why are you focusing on the title? He's asking about the research question.
Yeah, so the study question is the answer for the study question. It is in the introduction section, the background. So when you develop a question, you write some introduction and your hypothesis. So that's where we are now. So don't go into the results at all. The high prevalence, of course, it might be misleading, but that's how they are framed and the paper has been accepted. But let's go into that bit later. But now the study question, is that relevant to you or not? Because given that you people are living in Pakistan, do you think this question is relevant from your perspective?
I see. This is Huna from Group 5. We also agree to your point of view because the study question seems very much relevant. It's never done before, and they've did a kind of good pre-work on what to be included and what not to be included. And
okay, perfect. So I assume everyone agrees with this response, right? Sorry.
Hi, Dr. Vimal. I'm Sumara, group leader of Group 4. And as you have mentioned at the start, that critical appraisal is quite subjective. And that's what exactly happened in our group. So we have 3 different opinions. Some of the participants were with the view that yes, it is quite clear. And some of the participants were don't agree at all. And some were like somewhat. So usually in the critical appraisal like activity, there is a scoring. And if there is any difference, it is later discussed. So yes, we have different opinions.
Okay, fine. Whatever your response is, like whether the study question is relevant or not. See, I have clearly mentioned that I feel the study question is focused and relevant because of so and so reasons. So it's purely evidence-based response that I've given here. So likewise, when you are saying that study question is not relevant, then you should have an evidence to justify your point. So that is what I'm saying, talking about critical appraisal. Without evidence, don't blindly say that it is not relevant and it is relevant. You need to have an evidence to justify that the study question is relevant or not relevant. Is that all clear for everyone?
Yep.
Can we move on to the next question?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay, does the study have a stated hypothesis? Now you take the first chance.
Okay,
Before I
from
explain
Group
my
1.
perspective. Yeah, Group 1, go on.
We saw that there is not a clearly written objective hypothesis that could be tested. Testable format of hypothesis was missing. It was written in the form of we investigated the link between this and this, but it was not in the form of we hypothesized that those who were taking high caloric intake were more likely to have obesity or something like that. The relationship of 2 variables, the testable format of hypothesis was missing, I guess.
Okay, fine. So are there any other responses? Any other perspective in relation to this question?
This is a group leader of Group 2.
Yeah.
Yes, we have the same conclusion as the Group 1.
Okay, fine, good. Group 3?
Group 3, we concluded that they have mentioned that in the past studies, this high calorie diet has been linked to obesity, but they have not stated the hypothesis in this present study.
Okay. And what about Group 4 and 5?
Yes, I agree with
agree
Group
to
3.
this because usually you have the null hypothesis and etc. So it wasn't seen there. It wasn't very much clear.
Okay, remember one thing, as mentioned in the introduction section, they don't have to mention the hypothesis in the paper. Just because the hypothesis is not mentioned, it doesn't mean that it's a limitation of the study. Definitely not. Because sometimes the hypothesis is hidden in the introduction section. So this is my perspective. There's no clearly stated hypothesis, but the authors have clearly mentioned in the introduction that other studies looking at medical college
Yes.
professionals indicate that obesity is a big problem. So obesity is indeed a big problem, and they have justified that in the introduction.
Yes,
So
we
that
agree to
is,
that.
yeah, so exactly. So which means that even if the hypothesis is not mentioned, still they have indirectly mentioned the hypothesis to frame their research question. So I don't see that as a limitation from my end.
Yes, we agree.
Okay, good. So moving on to the next question. Did the authors use an appropriate method to answer the question? So let me share my responses. So basically, the study has used a cross-sectional study design, and which is basically the snapshot style method, and it is less expensive and it is a quick method, and that's the reason why they went for a cross-sectional study design. And of course, this cross-sectional study design has got negative or limitations. That is, you cannot determine the direction of the association. So you do not know, is it the change in the lifestyle which is contributing to obesity in these medical college students, or is it because of these medical college students who are obese who are changing their dietary pattern and their lifestyle? So it could be either way. So that cannot be determined with this particular study design, cross-sectional study design. But as mentioned in the study, their question is not about the direction of association. Their question is whether the lifestyle, the diet, and physical activity, are they being associated with pre-obesity and obesity? And for the question and for the hypothesis, they have used the right method. What about you guys?
सुनिए आपने पकड़ेंगे
Yes.
ये अभी इस वाली स्लाइड की मैंने पिक्चर ली है इसके बाद वाली क्या
I can't hear
From
you.
group
Sorry.
1,
Yeah.
from group 1, we had certain problems related to the confounding variables, but I guess that point is more relevant to the outcome and exposure variable questions, which will be coming later on. But we discussed that
So
point in this
confounding will
third
come
point.
later.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So other than that, the way those things were measured, the assessment of those variables, other than that, we did not find any other methodological flaws, obviously, which are inherent in the cross-sectional study design, those remain, but their study was for studying the prevalence. So cross-sectional study design is correctly representative of that.
Okay, fine. Any other responses apart from what I've listed over here?
So group 5 is, we also agree to these points.
Okay.
And yes, yeah.
Okay, good. So can I move on to the next question?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, was the study ethically approved? So it's now your turn, guys.
From group 5, we haven't seen anything documented related to ethically approval kind of stuff. Usually when it is documented. So we did not find anything.
It was not mentioned in the study. It was
Yes.
tested or not.
From group 1, we also say that it was not documented, the ethical approval from any institutional review board, but certain ethical aspects were taken into account, like informed consent from the participants. That was mentioned, but not from the review board.
Okay, fine. Any other response?
I agree with the rest of the members that our group decided, yes, the institutional review board is not mentioned, but they have given the clue. For example, they obtained the consent. So
okay, fine. Good. Let me. Sorry, do you have anything else to say?
No.
No. Okay. So these are my responses. There's no clearly statement showing that the study obtained ethical approval, but however, they have mentioned that informed consent was taken from the study participants. Generally, when they have mentioned about the informed consent, when you get the ethical approval, the informed consent from the participants also needs to be ethically approved. So which means that they must have got the ethical approval. They might have forgotten to mention that in the paper. So this is one side of the perspective. But on the other side, we do not know whether the study has obtained an ethical approval. So informed consent might not also be ethically approved. So we do not know. If a study is not ethically approved, it is not entitled to be published. You cannot publish a paper without getting ethical approval and informed consent from the participants. So which means that it is a very big question with regards to this particular study.
Yeah.
So this is one of the biggest limitations of this particular study.
Yes. In order to become more clear about this, we can also go to the journal guidelines and say, see over there if they allow the submission of the articles without ethical approval certificate or not.
Sorry, I didn't hear you properly. Can you be a little louder, please?
Yes, I was saying that we can also see the journal guidelines for this journal and see whether they allow the submission of articles without the ethical approval certificate or not. If not, then obviously this study would also have been approved ethically.
No. All articles which are getting published, they should have the ethical approval section in the paper. I don't think there's any journal which will allow you to submit or publish a paper without getting ethical approval.
Then I think they submitted ethical approval separately and they didn't mention in the article, because yes, it's important to submit ethical approval certificate in a PDF file to the journal.
No. It has to be mentioned in the article. Anyone reading the paper should know that the study has been ethically approved. It is by law, and it is
a good article should have mentioned
exactly
ethical approval.
May I add something, Dr. Vimal? But I was thinking that I looked at, for me, again, it was a big surprise because this journal is indexed by leading database. And for all journals which are peer reviewed, there is always a ethical approval. And usually even they ask for there's a special ID allocated for the ethical approval and the name of the institute. So yes, it was a big surprise that how it was approved by the reviewers. And usually there are 2 to 3 reviewers in such journals which are indexed by database.
no, but like for you, the only article which has been mentioned about the ethical approval. There are several publications where there is no mention of the ethical approval, and still they're published in very high impact factor journals as well. So when you read a paper, these are the things that you will have to think and critically appraise. There is one question in the question answer box. Does the ethical approval means to get approval from the institute where the data is collected? Not from the institute where the data is collected. For example, if you want to do a study in Karachi population, then the ethical approval needs to be obtained from the institutional committee, which is specific for the Karachi population. I'm not sure whether PNDS has got an ethical committee. Fayza, do you have an ethics committee?
Not yet, Dr. Vimal, not yet.
Okay, but if you want to do a study, where would you get an ethical approval?
Mostly people get approval from their relevant institutions where they are working, or like where they are working mostly.
Okay, fine. So, for example, if you're working
and also where the study is being conducted. Like, for example, if I conduct a certain study in a certain hospital, I get the approval from that hospital's ethical committee.
Okay, fine. So, yeah, every hospital will have an ethics committee and every university will have an ethics committee. But
Yeah,
for example,
exactly.
if you belong to a educational institution, but you want to do a study outside of that institution, but still you need to get an ethical approval from that institute. For example, like I'm from University of Reading and I want to do a study in Pakistan. So which means that if I want to do a study in Karachi population, then I'll have to collaborate with the university in Karachi, and I'll have to get the ethical approval from that university in Karachi, and also getting ethical approval from my university, that is University of Reading. So I need to get the ethics approved from 2 institutions. So it depends on like where and how you're going to do the study. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. Okay, were the subjects recruited in an accepted way? So there were like about 244 individuals were selected for the study, and both genders were eligible for the selection. And the generalizability of the findings were compromised due to the potential of selection bias, because there isn't much information about the recruitment process. This is entirely from my perspective. So I feel that there was selection bias because students who agree to participate in surveys are likely to be different to those who do not participate, because we do not know whether students or the students who participated were given money for the participation and for the time. So some people might not be interested in money, and some people might be interested in money, so they participated in surveys. And that can have an impact from the socioeconomic status of the students. The students who belong to the low socioeconomic status, they might be interested in getting that money, whereas students who belong to a very high socioeconomic status, they might not be interested in money, and they don't want to waste their time as part of the survey. So there is a confounding from the socioeconomic status, because we do not know how that survey was conducted. Because if you look at this particular study, which was done in this population study of women in Gothenburg, where they found that the dropouts of the study on average had a higher waist-tip ratio. So the study was something relating to obesity, and most of the dropouts had a higher waist-tip ratio, which means that they ended up with the study participants who had lower waist-tip ratio. So when you report the prevalence of obesity or central obesity, you're going to report a very low prevalence. So which is completely biased finding. And this is another study where the dropouts were more likely to be men. It's a study that was done in Swedish adolescents, and which clearly highlighted that the dropouts were more likely to be men. So the entire study was done mainly in women. So which is not going to be a true representation of the entire population. So in this study, the selection bias was clearly there, and it is very much important that the study failed to mention whether there were any dropouts. So we do not know that information from the study. So in terms of the recruitment, it was not very clear to me. What about you guys?
Okay, from group 1, I want to add something. We actually wrote the answer of this as positive. First point that is coming to my mind is that dropout rates is probably more related to follow-up studies like cohort or experimental, which are done in a longer time. So it was a cross-sectional survey. So at one time, we actually think about dropout rates or loss to follow-up or attrition or not? Second point that I want to highlight is that they used randomly generated computer numbers. If they actually did the actual random sampling, then but after selecting what happens in the actual random sampling is that they have a list of, like, say, all the students, all the eligible population that they had from the 4 medical colleges that they selected. And from those 4 colleges, they, like, for example, if they had 10,000 students from there, they had a list of all of them written down, and they had a computer generated or number against each of the name of the student. And then they generated a random number from computer, and whatever number appeared on the computer, they selected that participant. The eligibility or the consent of the participant must have been taken at a prior level rather than after selection of the sample. If a student was if the number of the student was computer generated, and that student did not give consent to participate, then this is not actually a good random sampling that they did. Random sampling should be done on a population frame that is already eligible and already consented for participation, and then you take out the sample based upon any random sampling technique that they use. So these are my 2 points.
Okay. Okay, good. Any other points?
Dr. Vimal, kindly check question answer section. Some attendees write their
Yeah, I'll try
queries
to
over.
answer. I'll try to answer those questions at the end because I
Okay.
think we are running out of time now. So
Okay, sure.
any other points in addition to what has been mentioned? No. Okay. So overall, the agreed response to this is the information on the recruitment process is very limited in the paper. So we are unable to say whether there could be any other issues. I mean, one is definitely selection bias. And in terms of random sampling, whether it was actually properly done, it's a very big question.
Yes.
So the next question is whether exposures accurately measured to reduce bias. So what are the exposures?
Exposures
What
are
are
dietary factors
caloric intake
and physical activity, I think.
Yes. So from my perspective, of course, the dietary reporting errors are very common with regards to self-reporting questionnaires. And that is all quite, we are all aware of that. And also, most importantly, the self-administered questionnaire, we do not know whether it is a validated questionnaire. And also, there is no rationale or any evidence to say that why they have gone for the 24 highest calorific food groups. And there's no reference for that. There's no justification why they went for that. And there was no evidence how the physical activity was examined. Did they look at people who are not physically active or moderately active and highly active? So did they do it as a tertile? So how that physical activity variable was considered, we do not have that information at all. The other way they could have reduced the bias by doing biochemical tests, because given that it's a self-reporting questionnaire for measuring the dietary intake, one way to overcome the self-reporting bias could be to do a biochemical test and prevent under-reporting, that is using fatty acid determinations from using blood samples, collecting the serum or the plasma, and doing the fatty acid determination. So these could be some of the ways by which you can overcome the underreporting. So this is my perspective. What about you guys?
I think this part, yes.
Sorry, from the group 2, we have same conclusion for physical activities as was yours, and for 24-hour recall also.
In group 3, I think I want to add another point. Even they have not mentioned which references they have used for food frequency questionnaire, the form. First, they have not used 24-hour recall, that is another issue. But they have not mentioned how they have calculated the calories and who have calculated the calories. What about the data collectors who were, they were self-reported basically, so that leads to very much measurement bias. So I think the data collection procedure was not well. It was
from
not
group 1. Yes. From group 1, we also want to add that they have reported the results as the daily caloric intake of the participants was related to so-and-so obesity parameters. But the 24 things that they mentioned do not represent the daily caloric intake of a person. So there are many other things which food frequency questionnaire cannot do. So 24-hour recall, cross-checked with the food frequency questionnaire, both these things together could yield more good results rather than a single one. And if they were not able to use the biomarkers. And second thing we wanted to add is that a positive thing in this exposure variable measurement was that they used the BMI cutoff values which were specific for the Asian population, because we see in many of the research articles they do not use.
One second, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. So the BMI, everything will come under the outcome. So here we are just looking at the exposures.
Yes, sure.
Okay, so we'll just move on to the next slide and discuss about.
May I add something, Dr. Vimal? I'm representing
please.
Group 4. First
please.
of all, is that you have gave a very good suggestion, right, regarding biochemical tests, which is least prone to the bias. but might be one of the reason is that most of the time biochemical tests are quite expensive, especially in country like Pakistan. So it is not possible, even if it is a funded project, because I've read that by the end of the at the end of the article, it is written that it was a funded project. So might be they don't have enough funds. This limitation can be overcome by using two diet assessment methods, because each diet assessment method has a limitation and strength as well. So in many studies, I've read that usually the researchers, they use two methods side by side from the same participant to overcome the overcome the limitations. And thirdly, I agree with all of you that, for example, IPAC is available. They can use such tool, or scoring can be mentioned. So these are some of the limitations of the exposures. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, very good points, definitely. So taking into consideration of all your points together, so the simple answer to this question is, were the exposures accurately measured to reduce the bias? I mean, overall, I don't think the exposures were accurately measured. The word accurate doesn't apply over here. And of course, the biochemical test is one way to prevent underreporting. So what I was trying to say is that these could have been mentioned in the paper as part of the discussion, but they haven't mentioned. So it is not a compulsory thing for everyone to make use of biochemical test. Even some of my studies where I've used FFQ, I haven't used biochemical test, and of course it's quite expensive. But like, of course, you need to acknowledge those limitations as part of your study design, and which is missing from that particular study. So that is something we need to take into consideration. So can I move on to the next question?
One point, please, more. One is screen time results. Regarding screen time is mentioned regarding watching TV, but how it was again, the scoring was not mentioned about the screen time as well. How it was
measured. Yeah. So let's look into that. The last question: the limitations and weaknesses.
Yes, so we also from group 5 felt the same points, and we also thought that other pointers like genetic factor, family history of disease, which will also have an impact on whatever the outcome is, were not included in the questions, and also the tool that was used was not reliable. We could not find this answer to this question, that how is it that only 24 foods can identify that these are only causing the BMI to be increased. So that was not justified anywhere.
Okay, yes, exactly. So that is all. I mean, we all agree on this. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So moving on to the next question. Was the outcome accurately measured to minimize the bias? The outcome is basically the obesity. So the objective measurements that were used to estimate the BMI and waist-hip ratio were according to the WHO guidelines. And the positive thing that the measurement methods were the same for all participants. But the one thing that they could have done is, it would have been helpful for us to have information about the qualifications of the person who did all the measurements. Because the assessor needs to be qualified to carry out all the anthropometric measurements. That is one thing. And secondly, before using any equipment, the equipment needs to be calibrated. So whether that calibration has been done, we do not know, because it's a study that has been done in at the medical college, and 4 different colleges were involved, so government college and private colleges, and we do not know why did they go for only these 4 colleges, and how these equipments were used, and did they carry these equipments with them. So we do not know any of this information, how these calibrations were done prior to the anthropometric measurements were done. So these are some of the issues that I found from my side. What about you guys?
I'm Mehreen Ahmed from Group 2. My point is, and they didn't mention how they trained the data collector or assessor. They didn't mention regarding who take the anthropometric measurements.
Excuse me, I'm from Group 3, Rabia. I think they have mentioned that it was self-reported. It was not measured.
No, I'm talking about
anthropometric measurements were measured.
I'm talking about the anthropometric measurements.
But they have not given the details how they were measured.
Yes, they didn't give any details regarding the anthropometric measurements.
So this is exactly what I said, like we do not know the qualifications or who actually did the analysis, who did the measurement. So if there are any other points other than what is already mentioned over here?
I think they have measured, but I understand from reading this statement that after filling out the questionnaire, anthropometric measurements were done according to WHO standards. So what I assume they have measured, but they didn't give the information. And if they may, like as Dr. Vimal mentioned, I want to add something more, because culturally we are quite different. So the information was not given that if the confidentiality and the privacy of the participants were acknowledged or not, or in which whether the data was collected. For example, if weight is usually collected in lightweight, and if the data was collected in winter, was this like considered? Like sometimes it is not possible. Culturally, anthropometric measurements are quite difficult to measure. And overall, in this methodology, the time, how much time was required for collecting all this information is usually mentioned in most of the papers. So again, it was not mentioned.
Okay,
Sorry, just one thing. I didn't get your point about the cultural impact.
For example, sorry.
Go on.
For example, the participants were females as well. And for the waist circumference, usually the measurement is taken by asking the participant to lift the shirt, which is not culturally appropriate in Pakistan. So what we usually do, we make sure that the data is collected in a separate room where the privacy of the participant is ensured. That is the part of the ethics approval.
Well, that's exactly what I had meant in this point. The qualifications of the assessor. If that person is trained enough to do the measurements in men and women, like who knows, like who can take into account of all these cultural impacts. So that is the kind of person we need, like for carrying out all these analysis. If it was someone else, then they wouldn't have done the analysis separately for men and separately for women. So we do not know how these measurements were done.
I want to add one. Yes, I want to add one thing. Another thing which was missing is the measurement bias, how the inter-rater reliability, how many times the measurements were taken, were they were averaged or not. That part is also missing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Absolutely, that's right.
Okay, and can we add this thing that as the title shows that we are linking obesity or pre-obesity with the dietary intake, obesity can be measured by other methods more accurately as compared to BMI. So there can be certain other methods, certain other anthropometric measurements which are more likely to like DIA or skin fold thickness or something like that, which could have given more information about the outcome.
See, you can go for the body fat distribution, body composition, body fat percentage, and you can also look at the intra-abdominal fat or subcutaneous fat, and whether the fat distribution has got any link with regards to the dietary intake and physical activity level. But that focus would have been like more relating to the body fat distribution. So here in this study, they have clearly mentioned obesity, and we all know that the worldwide way of defining obesity is based on BMI. And for central obesity, it's basically the waist circumference or the waist hip ratio. So if they had looked at body fat distribution, of course, that would have been much more a better variable for explaining obesity and central obesity. But here, they haven't looked at it. So they could have mentioned that in the discussion, which they haven't, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, can we move on to the next question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Have the authors identified all important confounding factors? So my response is the authors failed to mention that they adjusted for any confounding factors, and which is one of the other important limitations of this particular study. They haven't adjusted for any confounding factors. So we do not know whether the findings are true positive findings. And it would have been useful if the author had looked into all these confounding factors, because alcohol consumption, smoking, stress, parental income, the income of the student, the socioeconomic status, various other lifestyle factors, which could all can confound the relationship between the dietary intake and physical activity and obesity or pre-obesity. Do you have any other different response?
We wanted to
No.
add about the family history regarding obesity. That was also
Family history?
an important confounding variable.
Yeah, family history, yes, definitely. Any other
From group
confounding
5
variables?
also, we had response on this. And yes, I agree to the rest of the members. Family history and background and the socioeconomic status is an important contributor when we are talking about only these 24 food groups, because it really depends on the socioeconomic status as well. Not everybody can afford to have these zinger burgers every day.
And
Yes.
also one more thing that again we are going back towards that exposure variable, how that was assessed, because in that we assessed only the 24 things, but and whatever the person is taking in whole day, if even if that person is taking a very good thing like be it chapati or roti, and if that person is consuming 10 of those chapatis, then obviously the caloric intake of that person will also be high. So that thing should also it can also come in the confounder, that what other dietary habits that person has.
See, the one thing that was missing as part of measuring the exposure is we do not know the portion size. So that was actually missing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, agree.
Although they said that the serving size was assessed, and they actually calculated the average caloric intake of that person based on that, but I do not know how did they do.
But how they assess it is
Yes.
questionable. How they assess,
Exactly.
because everybody have different portion size, but culturally we see. So it is the I think it is the main confounding factor. It can be included. It
See,
should
it
be
all comes
mentioned.
down to it all comes down to the validation of the questionnaire that they used. If they have used a validated questionnaire, then we wouldn't be discussing all these things. So validation of a food frequency questionnaire or any self-reported questionnaire, it's very much important that it needs to be validated before you use it in a population. So which is
Yes.
totally
And
missing
there are
from.
genetic factors of related to obesity as well. So
Yeah, so of course, I mean, the study didn't look at the genetic factors, but overall, like just looking at the environmental factors and obesity, there are so many other confounding factors, because once you bring genetics, it's completely a different topic.
I meant to state that those people who were obese because of those factors should have been excluded from the study.
Because of what factor? Genetic factors.
Yes. Like
Okay, that I partially disagree, because it would be very difficult, because if you talk about obesity, there are about like 800 to 900 genetic factors involved. So which genetic factor will you take into account? So that's a very big question. And for a developing country, it's very difficult to do all these genetic analysis and take into account. To me, I feel that it is a very simple and a straightforward cross-sectional study, and they have utilized whatever is available and they have done a study. To that level, I do appreciate the authors and the effort. But on the other hand, in terms of the quality of the research, it has been completely compromised. Okay, so let's
yes,
move on to
true.
the next question. Where the data collected in a way that addressed the research issue. So the setting for the data collection was basically 4 medical colleges, and medical colleges were selected as there were no study in Pakistan looking at the obesity and physical activity levels or obesity and dietary intake in medical college students. The only thing is they should have mentioned, as we had already discussed this in detail, they should have provided justified reasons as to why the data was collected in this particular way, why they have gone for these government colleges, why they have gone for these private colleges, why didn't they look at only government colleges or only private colleges, why they have gone for these 4 colleges, and why they went for this random sampling, and what was the protocol and how the survey was done. So these kind of information, the methodology section sounded very vague to me. Do you have any other response other than this? So my answer is no. Were the data collected in a way that addressed the research issue? To some extent, yes, but it missed the entire point of explaining why they used this protocol.
We agree with you, Dr. Vimal.
Okay, so does that mean, can I move on to the next question then?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Did the study have enough participants to minimize the playoff chance? Now this is over to you guys.
So
I think I'm from group 3. I think the study, the way they have mentioned the sample size, that is 244. They said we assumed the prevalence of 20%. They have not used prevalence from any previous study. So this is one of the limitation. And they have assumed. I don't think we should assume the prevalence. And the data sample size was not enough. I think it should be more.
yes, we are on the same page from group 5. Only 244 participants cannot overall population from these medical colleges are, I mean, whether they're having this issue or not, this cannot be predictable in that sense.
And they have not mentioned through which tool they have calculated the sample size also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
no
exactly. They didn't mention how they calculate the sample size, and as Rabia says, they assume the prevalence 20%. So maybe they can use the National Nutrition Surveys as well, and the relevant article related to this topic.
Okay. Any
Like it's considered as a pilot study, not as a
Yes.
cross-sectional survey.
Okay, from group
Yes.
2, we had this. We had concern from group 2 also that the male and the female distribution, how was it decided? Although the sample size was taken, but the female to male ratio, females were more as compared to males. So this, how was this distribution done?
Regarding the gender distribution, I think that was clearly by chance. If they actually did the random sampling, then that was not under the control of the author.
Yeah, it wasn't
probably,
age matched or the gender matched.
Yes. I think if they did a random sampling of 244, then whoever came in their study, they had to take that person.
Yeah. Okay, so let me share my responses. So the study was strong as it used a power calculation to estimate how many subjects were needed to produce a reliable estimate of the measure of interest. But they have clearly mentioned that a proportion of 20% in a population of 10,000 and 95% CI gave a sample size of about 240 students. The 240 students is kind of a sufficient number for a pilot study, but in terms of generalizing the findings to all medical college students, that is not possible. So that is where the limitation comes. So of course, the sample size is definitely very small, but to answer some of the basic questions for a pilot study, it's definitely not a large study. It's not the main study. It's just a pilot study done in 240 people. So for a pilot study, it is sufficient. So that is my impression, because you can't do a pilot study in 1,000 or 2,000 samples.
Yes.
You don't call that as a pilot study. It's basically a pilot study. And as mentioned before, they have utilized whatever they had to give a solution to this problem. Do you all agree with this? Well, you don't have to agree, but like, did you understand my perspective?
Yes, justified.
Yes.
Okay, fine. So moving on to the next question. How are the results presented and what is the main result? It's a very pretty straightforward question. The results are presented as proportion, and the anthropometric measurements were listed as median differences. And the main finding was low levels of physical activity was observed among all groups, and there was no significant difference in the physical activity levels between obese and non-obese people. But there was a significant association between obesity and daily caloric intake. So the association was seen mainly with the dietary intake, but not with the physical activity. But one thing that the study could have mentioned in the discussion is they should have stressed the need for more replication studies. Given that it's a pilot study, it's not the conclusion. It is just the beginning stage. They have done a study which needs to be continued. If it needs to be continued, you need to give the pathway for that. What is the lead that you're going to give from your article? That lead was missing. So they should have mentioned that these findings needs to be replicated before you go on for obesity prevention strategies in the medical college student, because the study did not adjust for any of the confounding factors. Because I was quite surprised that there's no association between physical activity and obesity. So that by itself is a very much of a biased finding, and a finding which has been highly confounded. We all know that the physical activity is very much linked with obesity, and also the dietary intake is linked with obesity. Several studies have confirmed, and all of a sudden a study in 240 individuals saying that there's no association. So it's something like definitely there's something going on with the data analysis. So this is something that was missing as part of the study. But with regards to the presentation of the results, that was all fine. And of course, the findings are quite straightforward with regards to the methods that they have used.
Okay, my point is, I'm Marine from group 2. They mentioned that they use logistic regression, but I didn't find the logistic regression model in the result section, in the table, in the result section as well.
Yes, yes. It was mentioned in the last paragraph of results only, but not in the tabular format or in the figurative format.
Exactly.
I also have a point. I'm from group 3. The data was not presented very impressively. It was very confusing because they had only one table, which the title says monthly caloric intake, whereas in the table it was mentioned daily caloric intake and then monthly calorie intake. It was very confusing what the researchers were trying to calculate, because somewhere they mentioned monthly calorie intake and somewhere they mentioned daily calorie intake. So how they calculated monthly calorie intake, that was also very that was missing. Plus the data, the anthropometric data and the percentages that were not presented in table format. It was written, so it was very confusing. We have to go back and read again and again. It was, if it were presented in a table format, it would have been more clear, I think.
I think these are the reasons why the article has been published in a very low impact factor journal.
May I add something? I agree with Rabia that regarding table, and in table also the portion size is not mentioned, that like paratha, so a medium sized paratha or weight of the paratha, that would be more informative. And secondly, there is no certification of the data, like male and female. Like for example, definitely the diet intake, caloric requirement of male and female are different. So, and they have mentioned about I didn't found any information regarding results in result section socioeconomic status. So they didn't mention. And one of the because usually the journals they allow 3 tables or diagrams or illustrations minimum, but they have presented one, so they can use more or present more in a graph form or illustrations or in the table form. And also about the because they have collected the data both from the private sector and the public sector medical universities, and there is a huge socioeconomic difference, because in the public sector medical colleges, the students come from any socioeconomic status and it's just purely on merit, whereas in the private sector they are mostly from the elite class, so definitely their diet intake will be different. And thirdly, the data was collected both from the students living in a hostel and those who are living in the day scholars. So the data can be presented like in this way as well, that might be there are difference in their caloric intake or physical activity or screen time. So I think the data can be presented in much better way.
Okay.
Yes. And almost all points have been covered. So to summarize, they could have added a table of demographic or socio-demographic profile of the participants to get us to understand it well. Plus, regarding the stratification of data for different variables, they have mentioned those things in the written format in the result section and the discussion section, but not in the tabular format. So that was certain some sort of improvement that they could have done.
Yeah, I agree with your points. I mean, they should have certainly, taken a different approach of presenting the tables, like stratifying the data based on totiles of dietary intake or any other exposure which they could have used to stratify. As I said, like we do not know how the physical activity levels were used as a variable, whether it was a categorical variable or a continuous variable. So those information would have been helpful.
Plus, they have not mentioned that the data was skewed. They said they have reported median. They have reported median, but they have not mentioned that the data, they did some test to check the normality of the data. It was
Yeah,
skewed.
so
That's why
whether the
they mentioned.
variables
Yes.
were log
Yes.
transformed, we do
The
not know that.
analysis part was also not very well presented.
Good. Okay, fine. Any other points? Any additional points you have? No. Okay, fine. But just one thing I wanted to mention over here is, like, of course, like, I'm glad that you came up with all these points and in terms of presentation, all these issues. But you will have to understand, like, when you're looking at a paper from a journal which is a very low impact factor, don't have very high expectations that you're going to see something very interesting. The level of the impact factor will determine the quality of the article as well. Of course, these are important points that they should have taken into consideration. If they had taken into consideration all these points, then their article would have been in a much better journal, not in a low impact factor journal. Remember that when you're critically appraising a research article, take this into consideration when you're judging the quality of the article, because the impact factor of the journal is the first step to judge whether the quality of the paper is going to be good or not.
Yes, true.
Yeah. Any other questions? No. Okay. So let's move on to the next question. Was the data analysis sufficiently rigorous? Well, the data collection procedure method contained an in-depth description of the analysis process. They have shown a table, but as mentioned by you all in the previous question, including a table showing the anthropometric measurements and across different exposures, that would have been definitely useful. So this question is almost in relation to the previous question. Do you have any other points to add here?
Yeah, the regression part only.
Yeah, the logistic regression.
Yes, yes.
Yes, yeah, of course, yeah. That is missing.
It was missing.
The result. Sorry?
It was missing
Yeah,
in
yeah,
this.
of course. Anything else?
No, all good.
No. Okay, fine. Is there a clear statement of findings? Well, it's again a very straightforward question. So these are the main findings. I'm not repeating the findings again. Very clear findings. They have very clear findings, but of course there are some limitations with the methodologies. But in terms of reporting the findings, they are very clear. The main thing is, as discussed before, the study is limited because as the authors have failed to consider the portion size and the caloric density of the foods that have been consumed by the medical college students. So these are missing, but even though the findings they have mentioned are very clear, but it's very difficult to judge whether the findings are true positive findings. In terms of reliability and validity, it's a very big question, but they have a very clear statement of the findings. Do you have any other perspective?
I have only one comment that they have in one sentence they have written students, and in the end of that sentence they have written patients. The report,
Yeah.
there are
Interesting.
some typo errors also in the research. They have written private sector instead of public sector, so they have some typo errors.
Yes, of course. Like, I mean, if the paper goes to you and you happen to be the reviewer, you should definitely mention all these points to improve the quality of the paper, definitely. Any other points? Okay, fine.
No, I guess yes, we
sorry.
agree.
Okay,
Yes,
you agree.
we agree. Yes.
Okay, can the results be applied to local populations? Can the results be applied to local populations? So first of all, for a question something like this, you need to define what the local population is. So before you give me your response, tell me what do you mean by the local population? When you say local population, is that the population of the entire city, or the 4 medical college, or you're referring to the local population as all the medical college students from Pakistan, or you're just referring to the medical college students from those 4 universities? What do you mean by local population? Because the study has been done only in 240 students.
Yes, I
As
think
per
the
our
title says
understanding,
One at a time, sorry.
as per our understanding, group 2, it should have been population or general population or generalized to the non-medical student population.
I
I
think that
think
it
I'm
is
Sorry to
the
interrupt. When you say non-medical student population, so when you say local population, um, because this is a question that you will have to answer as part of this article. So can the results be applied to local population? Are you referring to the entire population of the city?
Entire population of the city, generally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I see your point. Yes.
I think it should be entire medical students of the city, not because this research title says medical students. So I think the whole population means medical students of Lahore city.
No, this response can vary amongst you, so you don't have to like stick on to one local population. So everyone can have their own perspective. So this is going to be my perspective. So sorry, you had something else to say.
No, I was just mentioning the same thing, that we cannot apply it for the rest of the population. We cannot apply it for a generalized population, as we have a dense population of having different, we know that the people are coming from different backgrounds. So this cannot be applied for everyone.
Yes.
Studying in a medical school, they're more educated, more food accessibility, different food habits, lifestyle, etc. So this cannot be applied to those who have different access.
Yeah, because these findings are more restricted to the university setting, university medical college students, not to arts and life sciences, because medical college students, they go through a different phase as opposed to other university college students. So it's very much restricted to the university medical students, and the results cannot be generalized to other setting. But most importantly, even to the university medical students from that city, the 244 is a very small sample size. It's a barrier for the generalizability. So it would have been useful if the researcher, the authors, had stratified the eating habits, or if they used a larger sample size, and they should have used a follow-up study as well, or they should have at least mentioned that in the discussion. And we do not know the stressful nature of the university. So because the study was done like for a while, right? And it would have passed through different term times. So at particular phase of the survey, students would have been taking up the exams. So they might be very stressful during that period. And because of high stress, they might be consuming a lot of junk foods. But like if they were on a holiday or a period like where there are no exams, then the stress might be much more lesser compared to the examination time. So the stress is something that has not been discussed or measured as part of the study. And of course, they should have used a more accurate and a validated questionnaire for measuring the dietary patterns and physical activity levels. So which, based on all these factors, you cannot generalize the findings to even to university medical college students. So that's my perspective.
From group 1, I want to add that the medical colleges, the sampling of medical colleges, because that has not been mentioned, although the participants, how they were selected, that has been mentioned that they were randomly selected, but how the stage sampling of actually the universities was done, that was probably based upon the convenience of the authors. So that's one of the reasons why we regard that these probably are not generalizable results.
Okay, good. Any other points to add?
Yes, Dr. Vimal. One is that's exactly what I was thinking about, different professional levels, because it can be both way. For example, first year medical student, they have very limited knowledge about in general health and nutrition or physical activity, but in different courses they study about nutrition. So might be the final year students, they have better understanding of nutrition, or they are more health conscious. And sometimes it's reversed, especially for those who are living in hostels, because I conduct clinic, nutrition clinic, and most of the students who are living in the hostels, they say that they have gained weight because they are living in a hostel for the last 5 years. And previously, when they were at home, their diet was quite healthy and home-based, homemade food. So they gained food because of dine out. So one point. And secondly, you might have noticed that in discussion section where usually the researchers compare and contrast their results, they have compared the results with those countries which are culturally and ethnicity is totally different. So I think the better option can be to compare and contrast the results which are conducted in Pakistan, but as you have mentioned that no previous such study is conducted in Pakistan. So I think better option can be studies conducted in India or Bangladesh, which are our neighboring countries, and culturally and ethnicity point of view, we are more similar. That is my point.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Totally agree. Yes.
Regarding the first point, that you mentioned, how is knowledge of that person related to actual practices? So probably many of the times that a person who has high knowledge, even he might not be practicing that knowledge. Like, for example, I am eating Lay's right now. So that's something that needs to be assessed. Knowledge does not translate to practice actually many of the times.
Okay, yeah, agreed. Any other points?
Okay, Dr. Vimal, I want to ask something regarding this point of critical appraisal. We are applying the results to the local populations. And how, actually, if we are assessing any article, what type of local population do we say that person is actually talking about? Do they mention that, or is that a subjective thing?
Okay, Afifa, if you don't mind, like, can I answer all the questions at the end of the session?
Yes, sure.
Just type your question in the Q&A so that I'll finish with this discussion of all the questions, and then I'll respond to each and every question.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So the next question is a research valuable? So this is a very important question that needs to be answered. Is a research value? At the end of the day, the reason why you're reading an article is like whether that's going to be helpful for you to develop a hypothesis and whether you can start a new study. So is that research going to be valuable for you? So although the study has a small sample size, my impression that it is the first study that has been conducted in this field, in medical college student, and the first study looking at obesity and physical activity, or obesity and dietary intake in this population. And the findings of the study show that there's an increased prevalence of obesity, and it shows that men have a higher calorific intake. And the research also highlights that the physical activity levels are extremely lower in students. Even though the findings are highly confounded, and there is a lot of bias, selection bias or self-reporting bias, and we do not know how these methods were conducted. There are so many limitations. But putting aside all these limitations, one of the most important innovative thing about this study is that this is the first study of its kind. So which is basically providing you the platform for you to build up other studies in these populations. So why should we focus on medical college students? No one had ever thought about it. But this study is starting several discussions. We are having a lot of discussion over here. So this study is kind of like instigation. It's instigating us to carry out various discussions and coming up with various hypotheses. And you are all talking about like this could have been done, that could have been done, and several things are being like new ideas and innovative ideas which are leading to new proposals in the field of obesity. So from that point of view, I see that it is definitely, the research findings are definitely valuable. But of course, we need to consider all the limitations as well. We cannot do anything with this research finding because it's highly confounded. You cannot trust this finding. It could be false positive finding and also a false negative finding with regards to physical activity levels. But the most important thing is this has provided a kind of a pathway towards developing further studies to look at medical college students. So in that way, I find that the research findings are overall research is valuable for people working in the field of obesity in Pakistan.
So you mean to
Yes.
say, Dr. Vimal, that more this study is, as compared to statistical significance, this study has more clinical significance? Because
No, I'm not talking about the findings at all. I'm talking about the idea of the study.
I think I agree with you, Dr. Vimal. Yes.
Yes, I also agree. One more point that can be added to this is that even if it is not generalizable or not applicable for a larger population set, but for at least we can use this data as a baseline for developing certain types of interventions or nutrition education programs for those particular colleges at least.
Okay, so I have to disagree with your point over there. So in terms of like going for intervention programs or intervention strategies, you need to have a proper, consistent finding.
More studies.
So
we have to do more studies on the same
exactly.
population.
So before you go into the level of longitudinal or intervention study, you need to have a consistent finding from the cross-sectional analysis.
Yes, sure. So it can act as one of the baseline data sets which can add up to with others as well to
be honest,
give as evidence.
It's a pilot study. We can do further studies with better quality and better sample size and better methodology, I think.
Also agree, this has set a good base
to provide an idea for you to conduct a similar study, taking into account of all these limitations. So which means that the study has to be repeated again to confirm all these findings. That's what I'm saying.
Agreed.
Yes.
So which means that, for example, you wouldn't have had any idea about like doing a study in medical college students until today, until I shared this article with you. Now you have an idea, okay, why shouldn't I look at medical college students? So if I'm able to confirm these findings, which means that 2 studies have confirmed, have come up with the same kind of findings, so which means that it has got some value. You're adding value to the existing research, right? So from that point of view, I see that this research is valuable. I'm not talking about the findings at all. If you're doing another study similar to this, taking into account of all the confounding factors and doing a well-established protocol, good study design, larger sample size, and well-established phenotypes, exposures, and outcomes, and you have a very interesting finding. Whether you're able to replicate this finding or not, that's secondary. But if you have a good study design and good structured protocol, and you're able to find something very interesting, then that by itself is a kind of a contribution to the field of obesity. So this research is valuable, but the research findings are not reliable. So someone had asked about a question about reliability and validity. So are you able to understand now how you judge the reliability and validity? I don't know who asked that question in the morning.
I asked.
Oh, you, okay, fine. Yeah, so this is how you judge the reliability of the findings. So it's entirely based on your expertise.
I think
Can I move on to the, yeah, sorry, go on.
I think this study lacks reliability and validity, but of course, if we want to, we conduct further similar studies and then we can check the reliability of the findings or the by using a more validated questionnaire and more validated methodology. I think then we can do a better study, or we can add.
Exactly. So they have given you a kind of a study design or protocol which you can follow, and it's entirely up to the next study to whether it's going to replicate the findings or not. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Are there any positives to the study? To me, the main positive thing, the first study to focus on eating behaviors and physical activity levels in relation to obesity in Pakistan. And it has provided important results showing the necessity to target medical students and improve their lifestyle. So they have given some kind of a pattern that the physical activity levels are lower in medical college students. So that is unlikely to be a false positive finding. So these are some of the important information that we have got. But these two are going to be the positive lead for future research work regarding this study in medical college students. So these are the only positives that I can think of. If you have any other positive aspects to the study, hello?
Yes, basically the
Yeah.
idea of the study is something that is positive, which we can again do, and with all the other good methodologies, and we can do the study again. But the idea that they sorted is a unique one.
Okay, yeah, agreed.
I agree. It has unlocked this field of obesity among the medical students. And I think this can also be applied to students from different fields and their way of consuming food and its association with the body weight and health. So I think this had set a good base, but this is not, I don't think it's a good, reliable source. It can be further explored with better methodology and representation.
Okay, good, definitely. Any other points? Or can I move on to the next question?
We can move to the next.
So are there any weaknesses to the study? It's the last question. So I've come up with all these limitations. So the first bit we have already discussed, and the second bit of the study, which you have already mentioned previously in the discussion, so you can go through all of these. So the personal attitudes of the students and the understanding of the healthy eating. So we need to know in which year of the medical degree so those students belong to, so that information is not available, and the socioeconomic status, the time management, the level of stress, and how often they snacked. And regarding, somebody was mentioning about the TV watching, so, and the frequency of skipping the meals. So the various factors which were not taken into account, which should be taken into account when replicating the study findings. If you have any points which are not listed here, let me know.
Yes, I have one point that the references that they used are mostly from more than 10 years back. This research was published in 2016, and many of the research articles that they have mentioned are from 2004 or 1990s or 1980s or 2002. Many of the research journals nowadays do not accept the articles which are mentioning or citing those researches which are more than 5 years back. So this one thing is one of the weaknesses as well.
Okay,
I think there are many weaknesses in the study. Of course, they have not mentioned references of the data sample collection calculator tool, as well as they have not mentioned the references from where the frequency food frequency form they have taken, and the other how they calculated the calories, which references they have used. The references are missing in the study, and they have not, of course, provided the ethical approval that is not mentioned in the study. There are many typo mistakes in the studies, and the results, the way they are presented, I think that is not also very well clear.
And one more thing, that certain of the weaknesses or limitations of the study, which the authors were not able to attain, could have been mentioned in the discussion section as limitations, but that portion is missing from this.
But they should have mentioned.
I agree with all of them, and secondly, usually at the end of the paper, the researchers give some recommendations, future plans, or so these are missing, and like authors usually identify themselves the strengths and limitations of the paper, which are not mentioned. What were these strengths? What were the limitations? What are the future plans? Or few recommendations?
Yep, definitely. Any other points? No?
Nothing. Yeah.
Okay, so so now I have a question to all the group leaders. If you were a journal editor, and you're getting this paper for review, would you be sending this paper to other reviewers to get a peer review done, or would you be rejecting the paper? Let's start with group leader 5.
Could you please repeat, Dr. Vimal? I couldn't hear properly due to this network issue.
Okay, so what I was saying is that if you were a journal editor, would you be accepting the paper or rejecting the paper? So what happens is that, like, when a paper is being sent or submitted to a journal, the journal editor will make the decision of whether it should go for the peer review or not. If it is not going for the peer review, it means that the paper is being rejected and it's being sent back to the authors. If it is being accepted by the editor, the editor will make the decision of sending it to the reviewers. So my question is, as a journal editor, what will you do if you get this paper?
So as keeping in view all of the weaknesses, I don't think it will be a good study to have a peer review, and especially on the bit of how the data was collected, I think I would not forward it for the peer review.
Okay, so when you reject the paper or send it back to the authors, what will be your what will be the main reason why you're rejecting it?
Of course, I'll mention all of the weaknesses that they've found, and because it was done for the very first time for this population. I believe the main.
Yeah.
I believe the major limitation of this study could be I can't see how have they really associated the dietary intake with the BMI. I am unable to connect properly. Like, I am a dietitian, I know how to take a proper 24-hour dietary recall or a food frequency questionnaire, or what food group is associated more with all of that. So I think a proper investigation on that part is missing. I feel that it is very limited.
Okay, fine. So let me move on to the group 4 leader. So just give me a quick answer. If you were a journal editor, what do you think you would have done? And give me the reason. Very briefly. Who is group 4 leader?
Dr. Vimal, can I do the group 2 first because I have to go?
Yeah, okay, group 2. Go on.
Okay. If this research was sent to me for review, I would write all the deficiencies in that and then forward it probably for the peer review. Why? Because this was the first of its kind. So putting it on the, rejecting it totally would not be the right thing. But if I send it for the peer review, I would highlight all the deficiencies to the editor and then probably tell the editor that this should be corrected by the author and then sent forward.
Okay, I would like to add something. I'm from group 2 also. I second with Muzammila. My point is, I will definitely go for peer review in order to improve the scientific deficiency which was deficient in that paper. So I will definitely go for peer review.
Okay, let's move on to group 3 or 4. Quickly, we are running out of time.
Group 1.
Group 1, yeah, go on.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to know that what type of journal am I editing? Because if that is a low impact factor journal or non-impacted journal, then probably I would have received similar types of articles and I would have gone for the peer review. That's very subjective thing, that what type of editor am I. Second thing is that if I had to make this for a peer review, I would have mentioned certain things which are in the hands of the editor, like the referencing thing and the things which are not related to the methodological flaws of the study, but which could be controlled or made more explicit or defined more, like the ethical approval was given or not, or such things with the sections which are missing from the article. I would have written back as an editor to the author, and then after receiving the revised version of the paper, then I would have gone for the peer review.
Yeah, that's exactly what a journal editor should do. That is, sending it back to the authors to revise the proposal to take into account of the ethical approval. Because without seeing the ethical approval statement, as a journal editor, you shouldn't be sending it to any of the peer reviewers. That is the only important point. Because all the other things, dietary intake measurements or physical activity measurements, obesity measurements, all the other limitations, not mentioning about confounding factors, or regression, everything, they are all secondary.
Yes.
The most
Yes.
important thing is the ethical approval. If the ethical approval has not been mentioned in the paper, it has to be sent back. You don't have to reject or you don't have to accept the paper at that stage. You just have to go back to the authors. Could you please mention about the ethical approval? If they have not obtained it, they are not going to send it back to you. So it's as simple as that. So which means that this journal hasn't done that, and they haven't used that quality control measures as part of the journal editing process. And that is one of the main limitations of this particular study. So that is all with the critical appraisal. So I have few questions over here. There are 7 questions. I think they're all just the points. I don't think they are questions, right? Am I right? Does ethical approval means to get approval from the institute? That I've already answered. Do we need ethical approval for online survey in Pakistani population? Yes, ethical approval is required when you're collecting any personal or confidential information about an individual. If you're getting an information about a person's age or a gender or their BMI or any measurement relating to that person, that is personal information for an individual. And you do not have any rights to publish that data without the approval from the ethics committee and also getting the consent from that individual. So even for a survey, you definitely need ethical approval. And above 18 years autonomous in their decision. So we say that the study should not be selected for public as it lacks ethical. When informed consent was taken and they showed their willingness to, I think ethical approval was not. No, ethical approval process involves getting approval for the informed consent as well. Because when you submit the ethical approval application, you will have to submit the informed consent letter as well, the form. This is the informed consent. Have you mentioned all the details in the informed consent? That needs to be approved by the ethical approval committee, whether you're doing a study in below 18 years or above 18 years, it doesn't matter. You have to get the informed consent. If it's below 18 years, you have to get the consent from the parents. Above 18 years, you definitely need to get the consent from the participants. And even the calibration of instrument also required after measuring 30 to 57. They should mention, yes, that's a point. Okay, what do we consider as local population during critical appraisal? In the point of application to local population. Again, that local population, nobody is going to ask you this question. Are the findings generalizable to local population? I've given you all these questions for you to think when you're reading the paper. Is that local population could be Karachi population, or the local population could be people belonging to the medical college or medical college university, or it could be just all the medical college students from Pakistan. It depends on how you define the local population as.
This is my question.
Yeah.
Yes. I wanted to ask that during a critical appraisal, do we regard that local population, what is in the mind of the reader, or what the authors have actually tried to generalize the results on? We consider that at their local population.
No, that's what I'm saying, that generalizability depends on how you define the local population.
How the author?
No, like you're reading the paper, right? You're doing a critical appraisal of an article. So if you're thinking the local population is medical college students, so you have to generalize it according to that local population.
Okay, thank you.
Do you understand this? Is that clear? Did I answer your question, Afifa?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah. The other Marine, you have suggested a point. Why are we particularly discussing this paper and not any other? Well, I think you would have asked this question if I had given you another paper. Why this paper and not any other paper, right? So I think I've answered all the questions. Fayza? You've raised your hand.
Yes. No, it was mistakenly raised.
Okay, that's fine. So we have come to the end of the critical appraisal session now. So I'm sorry, like it has gone like beyond 1 hour, I suppose. So, but I guess like we had interesting discussion. So I hope it was useful for you all.
Fayza, would you like to conclude the session, Fayza?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Vimal, for such a wonderful workshop. And I hope everyone would be finding it very beneficial for them. And I will request one or two of the participants if they can just give us a very brief review about today's workshop. Because I know there is a lot for improvement in every session we organize. We have run a little bit, not a little bit, but we have extended the workshop for 1 hour. So we had no idea that this session would be so interesting and everybody would like to discuss it in detail. So I think I would request Dr. Sumera. Um, Dr. Sumera, can you give some comments briefly? How did you find this today's workshop?
Thank you very much, Fayza, and thank you very much, Dr. Vimal. As expected, it was really good. It was great learning for me, and I'm also thankful to PNDS and the group members. We had great discussion, and I have one suggestion that the list of the questions which were provided just before the workshop, if it can be disseminated before workshop within the group, and then we can have some preliminary discussion along with the paper, and then we can discuss more, because the time slot was quite limited. 40 minutes were quite limited to critically appraised paper, because there are different critical appraisal tools available, and so I think it would be better to share before workshop. That's what I want to say. Otherwise, it was perfect. It was really, really good opportunity for me and my group members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumera.
Thank you,
So
Sumera.
I would like
we generally, sorry, Faiza, just one point. Like
yeah,
I've just
sure.
seen,
Carry on, please, Dr. Vimal. No,
yeah,
carry
yeah.
on.
So because we generally do this as kind of like a half a day workshop. Like we start in the morning at 9 o'clock and we finish around like 1:30, 2 o'clock, and we give about like 2 hours for the groups to interact and come up with different points. So that was not possible because, like, I mean, I was informed that it's kind of generally 2 to 3 hour slot that was available. So I was trying to accommodate as much as possible. And I generally don't share the article or any questions beforehand. And just for the sake of the fact that it was only 40-minute discussion, I had shared the article in advance so that you had some time to go through the article. Because the reason why I sent you the article the previous day is that I want you to read that article, but after my introduction session, how did you find like my points and how you incorporated that into your discussion? So that difference I wanted you all to observe. So that's the reason why I didn't send you those 17 questions. Because if I had sent you those questions, you would have already looked into that and it wouldn't have encouraged all these discussions. So I want you to, because generally when you read a research article, you wouldn't be spending like 2 days on a research article. You hardly spend like 15 minutes or 20 minutes on a research article. In that 30-minute slot, how are you good in critically appraising a research article? That is exactly what this whole workshop is about.
Yes, I agree, Dr. Vimal. Now I would like Afifa to say a few words as she's representing from Lahore.
Yes, sure.
I would like her. Afifa, would you like to say a few words on this workshop? How was
Yes.
your experience?
Yes, thank you so much. I want to say that although I am currently doing my doctoral degree in nutrition, and I have been teaching public health nutrition and epidemiology, that's my favorite subject. I want to say that I have actually wrote down many of the things which were new to me, and which were discussed by Dr. Vimal in a way that my perspective of those things became more clear. So I'm really appreciative of the fact that PNDS has organized this session, and the interaction of the participants in the groups. That was really good thing. We actually learned many things from other participants as well. And sure, the thing that was mentioned by the other commentator, that we were short of time. That's the valid thing. But obviously, when we are running through, when we are vertically reading any article, then we have a very short time to critically appraise that. So the 17-point objective criteria that was given, that's very good thing that we were very closed-ended thing that was given by Dr. Vimal for us to give out the strengths and weaknesses of this article. So overall, this effort was really good, and I look forward to certain sessions as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Afifa, so much. And it's we like Dr. Vimal has been always very kind to us whenever we ask him, and in fact, we are looking forward to welcome him in person in Pakistan as soon as things get normal. And definitely, it was a great learning for all of us, and the way he explained things is very, very much. You have all seen that. Is very explicitive, and it looks like you are understanding more and more when Dr. Vimal is explaining. That's why I requested him to do this session online, because if you are not finding time or because nowadays situation is very uncertain, we are not sure for how long we'll be conducting these sessions online. So Dr. Vimal, thank you once again, and we will be very much happy if you keep doing these kind of session with our members, and I'm sure it will definitely help our members to grow and learn things very efficiently, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Fayza, and thank you everyone for joining the session, and I'm glad that you all enjoyed it. So see you again sometime for another workshop.
Okay, thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.